The lights went out at exactly the wrong moment. I was standing outside the human embassy on Council Station, holding a datapad full of trade numbers I no longer cared about, when every window in that building went dark at once. Not flickered, not dimmed. Switched off, like someone had reached out and closed a hand around the whole structure. My name is Vexthal Orin. I am the third speaker of the Galactic Council, which means I am important enough to be told things, but not important enough to be told them first. That night, I was told nothing. I simply stood there, watching the human embassy go quiet, and felt a kind of cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the station's climate controls. Security drones swept past me toward the entrance, their lights spinning red across the plaza. I followed them, mostly because I did not know what else to do. A young officer named Peter Lang was already at the door, running a scanner over the locking mechanism and shaking his head. "It's not broken," he said, more to himself than to me. "It's shut down. On purpose. From the inside. Where is the ambassador?" I asked. Peter looked at me with an expression I would see many more times over the coming weeks, on many different faces. It was the look of someone realizing that a question they thought was simple did not have a simple answer. "He left a message," Peter said. "For the whole council. It's already been sent." I did not wait for permission. I pulled up the feed on my own pad, standing right there in the plaza, while dozens of other delegates gathered around me doing exactly the same thing. The message was short. It did not shout. It did not threaten. That was, somehow, the most frightening part of it. "To the Galactic Council," it read, "humanity is withdrawing from all diplomatic channels, effective immediately. All treaties remain honored until their natural expiration. All trade agreements will be fulfilled as written. No further negotiation, discussion, or dialogue will be entered into. This decision is final." There was no signature beyond a single name: Daniel Cole, Ambassador of Earth. I read it 3 times before I understood that I had, in fact, understood it correctly the first time. Around me, the plaza had gone strange. A Kethran trade delegate laughed out loud, a short, surprised bark of a sound, and said something about finally being rid of the humans and their endless questions. A pair of Yathiri diplomats stood very still, their long fingers pressed together in a gesture I knew meant worry. An older Voss merchant, who had done business with human traders for decades, simply sat down on a nearby bench and put his head in his hands. I felt none of their relief and none of their simple worry. What I felt was much smaller and much sharper, a question lodged behind my ribs like a splinter. Why now? Humans did not do things without reasons. In the 11 years I had worked alongside them, in committee rooms and border negotiations and long, tedious trade summits, I had learned exactly one reliable thing about the species. They complained, they argued, they filed formal objections in triplicate, and demanded hearings, and pushed back on every rule they thought was unfair, sometimes for hours at a time, sometimes for entire sessions that made the rest of us wish we had never invited them to speak. Humans who cared did not go quiet, they got louder. So a silence this complete, this sudden, this total, was not the sound of humanity giving up on us. It was the sound of humanity deciding we were no longer worth the noise. I stood in that plaza for a long time after the others had drifted away, staring at a building with no lights in it, and I understood, in a vague and unformed way, that something had shifted beneath all of our feet. I did not yet know what. I did not yet know how badly. But I remember thinking, very clearly, that whatever came next would not be decided in this plaza, or in this station, or by anyone standing here at all. It would be decided somewhere far away, by people who had already stopped waiting for us to catch up. By morning, the council chamber was in an uproar that I can only describe as embarrassing. Representatives from 43 species had crowded into an emergency session meant for 12. The air recyclers strained under the mixed atmospheres. Voices layered over each other in 6 different translation feeds until the whole chamber sounded like a badly tuned instrument. Someone had already proposed sanctions against Earth. Someone else had already proposed a formal apology, though nobody could agree on what, exactly, we would be apologizing for. I sat in my usual seat near the back, half listening, and watched High Speaker TiesHFY try to bring the chamber to order with a patience I did not share. She was old, older than most council members serving today, and she had negotiated the original trade framework with Earth herself, back when humans still needed us more than we needed them. "Silence does not mean hostility," she said, when the chamber finally quieted enough for her to be heard. "Humans have their own customs. Perhaps this is simply a period of internal reflection." I almost laughed, though nothing about the situation was funny. TiesHFY had spent decades studying humans and had still, somehow, missed the point entirely. Reflection was not what a species did right after its representative sent the single coldest formal message in the history of interstellar diplomacy. I raised my hand, and after a long pause, she nodded at me. "With respect," I said, "I do not think this is reflection. I think it is a decision, and I think we should be asking why it was made, rather than debating what to call it." A ripple of discomfort moved through the chamber. Nobody likes being told they are asking the wrong question, especially not in front of 42 other species. "Third Speaker Oren," TiesHFY said, in the tone she used when she wanted to end a conversation without technically ending it. "Your concern is noted." Noted, not addressed, not investigated, noted and set aside, the same way the council set aside most things that were inconvenient to look at directly. I left the session early, which was not something I usually did. I walked the long way back through the station's outer ring, past the observation windows that looked out over the dark stretch of space between our territory and the border systems nobody liked to talk about. I stood there for a while, looking at nothing in particular, and thought about the ambassador's message again. All treaties remain honored until their natural expiration. That line kept catching on something in my mind. It was not the sentence of an angry species lashing out. It was the sentence of someone finishing a piece of paperwork before walking out a door they had already decided to walk through. Humans do not close doors gently unless they have already found another way out. I did not know, standing at that window, what door humanity had found. I did not know what lay past our border in the dark systems nobody discussed. I only knew, with a certainty that unsettled me more than the silence itself, that somebody on Earth had looked at the entire Galactic Council, weighed what we were worth to them, and decided the answer was almost nothing. And I intended to find out why. I did not go back to my quarters that night. Instead, I walked to the small observation deck reserved for junior delegates, the one nobody senior ever used because the chairs were uncomfortable and the heating rarely worked properly. It was empty, as I expected, and I sat there for a long time with the lights of the station reflected faintly against the glass. I thought about the first time I had ever met a human delegate, many years earlier, during a minor dispute over shipping lanes that nobody now remembers or cares about. She had argued for 6 straight hours without once raising her voice, citing regulation after regulation, wearing down the opposing delegation not through anger, but through sheer, patient persistence. I remembered thinking, at the time, that this was a species built entirely out of stubborn hope. A species that believed, deep in its bones, that if you simply kept talking long enough, kept explaining clearly enough, eventually the people across the table would understand. That memory sat uncomfortably against the silence of the embassy behind me. Somewhere between that shipping dispute and this cold, dark night, humanity had apparently run out of that particular kind of hope, and I found myself wondering what it took to exhaust a species that patient. A soft chime interrupted my thoughts. A message, routed through an unofficial channel, from an address I did not immediately recognize. I opened it and found only a short line of text. Third Speaker Oren. If you are asking the right questions, you already know this was not sudden. Look at what the Border Committee closed without review. You will not like what you find. A friend. I read the message 3 times, the way I had read the ambassador's withdrawal notice, searching for meaning beneath the surface of the words. I did not know, in that moment, who had sent it, though I would learn soon enough. I only knew that somebody inside the system, somebody with access to records I did not yet have, wanted me to keep pulling at the thread I had already started to notice. I closed the message and sat with it for a long while, the station humming quietly around me, the human embassy still dark across the plaza. Whatever I found next, I understood, was going to change how I saw this council, and how I saw the years I had spent serving it, without ever once asking whether it deserved that service. It took me 4 days to get access to the archive room nobody wanted me to use. Officially, council records older than 2 years were open to any speaker conducting research. Unofficially, the archive clerks had learned to slow-walk requests that made their superiors uncomfortable, and my request, filed the morning after the human withdrawal, made a great many superiors uncomfortable. I was told the system was undergoing maintenance. I was told the relevant staff member was unavailable. I was told, twice, that my request had been misplaced. On the 5th day, I stopped asking politely. I found Peter Lang, the young security officer from the embassy, working a quiet shift in the station's lower administrative levels, running diagnostics on systems nobody else wanted to touch. He had been reassigned there after the withdrawal, along with most of the human station staff, since there was suddenly very little diplomatic work left for any of them to do. "I need old transcripts," I told him, without much preamble. "Border committee sessions, anything involving human reports from the last 3 years." Peter looked at me for a long moment, the way a person looks at someone they are deciding whether to trust. "You're the one who spoke up in the emergency session," he said. "The one who said it was a decision, not a mood." I did. "Most of the council thinks it was a mood." "Most of the council," I said, "has never once had to explain itself to a species that files formal objections for a living." That got the smallest hint of a smile out of him, the first I had seen since the lights went out. "I'm not supposed to have access to sealed committee logs," he said. "But I'm also not supposed to have been reassigned to cleaning duty after 11 years of embassy work, so I've stopped worrying too much about what I'm supposed to do." He pulled up a terminal and, after a moment's hesitation, gave me access to a set of archived border committee transcripts that had never been widely circulated. It took me most of that night, and most of the next, to read through all of it, but by the second night I understood something that made the cold feeling in my chest turn into something closer to shame. Humans had been warning us for years. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently, in the dry and repetitive language of official reports. 3 separate times over the previous 2 years, human sensor teams operating along the perimeter had flagged unusual fleet movement patterns in the unclaimed systems past our shared border. 3 separate times they had submitted the data to the Border Committee for review. 3 separate times the committee had classified the reports as unverified and tabled them for further study. I read the meeting notes from the second submission particularly closely, because they contained something I had not expected to find. A quote, recorded in the transcript, attributed to Ambassador Daniel Cole. "We are not asking the committee to act," the transcript read. "We are asking the committee to look. That is all. Just look." The committee had not looked. The committee had scheduled a follow-up review for 8 months later, which had then been delayed twice more due to unrelated scheduling conflicts, and had finally been quietly closed without further discussion 14 months after the original report was filed. I sat back from the terminal and let that settle into me. Humans had done exactly what the council asked of them. They had followed procedure. They had filed their reports through the correct channels. They had waited, patiently, for over a year, for a committee that could not be bothered to reschedule a meeting. And then, apparently, they had stopped waiting. I needed to understand more, and I needed someone who had actually sat across from human diplomats and understood how they thought, not just how they filed paperwork. I remembered a name from the old trade negotiations, a retired diplomat who had represented the Aetheri during the early years of human contact, back when nobody trusted anyone and every meeting felt like it might collapse into disaster. His name was Warren Locke, though that was not his birth name. He had taken a human-sounding name decades ago, during a long posting on one of the joint research stations, half as a joke and half, I suspected, out of genuine affection for the species he had spent his career studying. He was old now, retired to a quiet residential ring on the outer edge of the station, and he agreed to see me only after I mentioned Daniel Cole's name 3 times in my message. His quarters were small and cluttered with old physical books, a habit he had picked up from decades among humans who apparently still preferred paper for certain things. He offered me something warm to drink and settled into a worn chair across from me, with the unhurried patience of someone who had stopped needing to impress anyone a long time ago. "You want to know why they left," he said, before I had even finished explaining myself. "I want to know why now," I said. "The timing feels deliberate." Warren nodded slowly. "Everything humans do is deliberate. That is the first thing people misunderstand about them. They argue loudly, they complain constantly, and because of that, everyone assumes they are emotional creatures acting on impulse. They are not. They are one of the most patient species I have ever studied, right up until the exact moment they decide patience has stopped being useful. And then they stop asking," he said, completely. "Humans do not walk away from conversations that still matter to them. I watched it happen once before, on a smaller scale, during a resource dispute early in the joint research program. A human engineer spent months trying to get safety concerns addressed through proper channels. Nobody listened. One day he simply stopped filing reports and started building his own solution instead. When someone finally asked him why he had gone quiet, he said something I have never forgotten. What did he say? Warren looked at me over the rim of his cup. He said, "I stopped talking because talking wasn't working anymore. I found something that does." The words sat heavily in the small, cluttered room. "You think that's what this is?" I said. "Not anger, not an ultimatum, just humanity concluding that talking to us has stopped working." "I think," Warren said carefully, "that humans do not sever ties with people they still need something from. They sever ties with people they have decided they no longer need to convince. And I think, third speaker, that whatever they saw in those border reports, they have stopped waiting for us to see it too." I left his quarters with more questions than I had arrived with, but one thing had become clear enough to keep me awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my own small quarters. This was never about pride, or insult, or some perceived slight against humanity's standing among the council. Humans had asked us to look at something dangerous. We had looked away, so they had stopped asking and started acting on their own. The following day, I requested a private meeting with High Speaker Nell Ashra and told her, as plainly as I could manage, what I had found. She listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual for her, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "You believe the Border Committee's negligence caused this," she said finally. "I believe the Border Committee's negligence removed any reason for humans to trust that this council would act on a real threat," I said, "which from where I am sitting amounts to the same thing." "That is a serious accusation, Orrin. It is a documented fact, High Speaker. I can send you the transcripts." She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression shifted, just slightly, from the composed authority she usually carried into something more uncertain. "If you are right," she said, "then the council has a much larger problem than an angry ally." "I don't think they're angry," I said quietly. "I think they're already past that. I think somewhere out there, past the border, humans found something none of us wanted to believe was real, and they have decided that dealing with it matters more than dealing with us." Nell Ashra was silent for a long moment, staring past me at nothing in particular. "Then we had better find out what it is," she said, "before they finish handling it without us." Before I left her office, I told her about the anonymous message I had received on the observation deck. She read it twice, her expression unreadable, and then handed the pad back to me. "You should be careful, Orrin," she said. "Whoever sent this either wants you to succeed or wants you exposed for digging where you were told not to. Sometimes those two things look identical until it is too late to tell them apart. I intend to keep digging regardless, I said. I would be disappointed if you did not, she said, and for the first time since I had known her, I saw something like real respect in her expression. But watch your steps. The committee that buried those reports did not do so by accident, and people who bury things rarely enjoy being reminded that someone remembers where the shovel is. Her warning stayed with me over the following days, as I quietly gathered more names, more transcripts, more small fragments of a picture that was only beginning to take shape. I learned that the Border Committee's chairperson, a cautious and unremarkable delegate named Corin Vale, had personally signed off on closing all 3 human reports without full review, citing budget constraints and staffing shortages that, upon closer inspection, did not appear to have affected any other committee's workload during the same period. I did not confront him directly, not yet. I had learned enough by then to know that confrontation without proof accomplished nothing except giving the guilty time to prepare their excuses. Instead, I kept gathering, kept reading, kept turning over every scrap of evidence that suggested this was not simple negligence, but something closer to willful blindness, dressed up as procedure. I did not know, at the time, how close we were to running out of that particular window of opportunity. I only knew that the pieces I had gathered so far, the tabled reports, the quiet warnings, the patient waiting that had finally worn through, were only the beginning of a much larger picture, one that I was not yet prepared to see in full. That would come later, delivered to me not by a committee transcript, but by a nervous contact meeting me in a maintenance corridor, carrying data he was not supposed to have and a warning he clearly did not want to give. The message arrived at an hour when only maintenance crews and desperate diplomats were awake. It came from Peter Lang, 3 words long, lower ring, corridor 9, now. I left my quarters without changing out of my sleep clothes, which tells you something about how quickly I moved. The lower ring of Council Station was a maze of pipes and cabling and dim emergency lighting, the kind of place delegates like myself rarely visited and rarely thought about, which was, I suspected, exactly why Peter had chosen it. He was waiting in a narrow service corridor, a data drive clutched in one hand like something that might burn him if he held it too long. "I shouldn't be giving you this," he said, before I had even fully arrived. "I could lose my clearance. I could lose worse than my clearance." "Then why are you here?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. "Because Daniel Cole trained me. He taught me that following orders and doing the right thing aren't always the same list, and when they're not, you're supposed to know which one matters more." He held out the drive. "This is sensor data," he said. "Human sensor data, gathered over the last 6 months, from arrays positioned along the outer edge of the perimeter. It was never submitted to the Council. Daniel stopped submitting reports after the 3rd one got buried. He kept collecting anyway. He just stopped sharing." I took the drive with a hand that was not entirely steady. "Why give it to me now?" "Because you asked the right question in that emergency session," Peter said. "Because you're the only council member who seemed to understand this wasn't a mood, and because in about 2 days, none of this is going to matter whether the council understands it or not. Things are already moving." He would not tell me what he meant by that, no matter how I pressed him, and a moment later he was gone, back into the maze of the lower ring, leaving me alone with a small drive that felt far heavier than its size suggested. I did not sleep that night. I sat at my terminal and opened the files one by one, and by the time the station's artificial morning cycle began, I understood exactly why humanity had stopped waiting for permission. The data was methodical, in a way that only made it more unsettling. 6 months of sensor readings, cross-referenced and time-stamped, showing a slow, patient, and very deliberate pattern of movement in the systems just past our shared border, the ones the Council's official maps still marked as unclaimed and uninhabited, ship signatures that matched nothing in any registered species database. Communication bursts on frequencies nobody had ever cataloged, and, most disturbing of all, a series of quiet incursions into 3 separate human research outposts along the edge of that dark region, each one occurring within hours of a council session where the danger had been dismissed as unverified. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they were watching the council's response as closely as the council was failing to watch them. I went through the outpost reports twice more, looking for anything I might have missed the first time, and on the third pass I noticed a detail buried in a footnote that made my hands go still over the terminal. The incursions at the research outposts had not been random. Each one had occurred at a facility studying a different aspect of long-range detection technology, as though whatever was testing our defenses was not simply probing for weaknesses in general, but specifically mapping how well we could see it coming. That detail alone told me something the raw numbers had not. This was not a wandering fleet stumbling across our border by accident. This was reconnaissance, patient and deliberate, conducted by something that understood exactly what it wanted to learn about us before it decided what to do next. I thought again of Warren Locke's description of humans, patient right up until the moment patience stopped being useful. I wondered, sitting there in the gray early light of the station's morning cycle, whether the thing gathering beyond our border operated on a similar principle, and whether we would recognize the moment its patience ran out any faster than we had recognized humanity's. I sent a copy of my findings to Peter Lang, thanking him quietly for the risk he had taken, and asked him to keep watching for anything else that might surface through channels the council itself was too slow to check. He replied within the hour, a short message that stayed with me for the rest of that day. Daniel always said the worst part of waiting is not knowing which day the waiting stops mattering. I think we may be close to finding out. I brought the data to Nell Ashra first thing that morning, and for the first time since I had known her, I watched real fear move across her face. "This has been happening for 6 months," she said, scrolling through the files with hands that had gone very still, "and we knew nothing." "The Border Committee knew," I said. "They chose not to know more." She looked up at me. "Does the wider council know any of this?" "Not yet. I wanted you to see it first." "Why?" "Because you are the only person on this council old enough to remember what it looked like when humans still trusted us, and I think we are going to need that memory very badly in the coming days." She called an emergency session within the hour, but before I could present the data, before the wider council could even be briefed properly, the situation changed beneath us in a way none of us had prepared for. Reports began arriving from 3 different border monitoring posts within the same 20-minute window. Unidentified fleet movement, confirmed by multiple independent sensor arrays, no longer unverified, no longer a matter of interpretation, something large, coordinated, and clearly non-council in origin, was moving through the dark systems past the perimeter, and it was not moving away from our territory. It was moving toward it. The chamber that had been arguing about sanctions against Earth 2 days earlier now erupted into something closer to genuine panic. Delegates shouted over each other in a dozen languages. Someone demanded immediate mobilization of Council defense fleets, forgetting, apparently, that Council defense fleets had not seen real combat readiness in over a generation and existed mostly as a symbolic gesture toward species who still remembered older, more dangerous eras. I stood at the edge of that chaos and felt something cold settle into certainty. We were not ready. We had never been ready. We had spent so long congratulating ourselves on decades of peace that we had forgotten peace was a condition, not a guarantee, and the one species that had apparently understood that difference, the one species that had kept watching the dark corners of the map long after everyone else had stopped bothering, was the same species we had just finished ignoring for 3 separate warning cycles. "Where is Earth's fleet?" someone finally shouted, over the noise. "Are they responding to this?" Nell Ashra pulled up the tactical overlay with hands that were, I noticed, no longer trembling. Her fear had settled into something calmer and more dangerous, the look of someone who had stopped being surprised and started being useful. "Human fleet elements are already positioned along 3 of the 4 affected systems," she said, reading from a feed that had clearly only just reached her. They have been positioned there for approximately 11 days. The chamber went quiet. 11 days. Nearly 2 weeks before the incursion had become visible to anyone else's sensors. Humanity had already moved ships into place. Not after the withdrawal message. Before it. The severing of diplomatic ties had not been a reaction to some sudden crisis. It had been a housekeeping measure, a door quietly closed after the real decision, the decision to act without us, had already been made. I thought of Warren Locke's words in his cluttered little room. Humans do not walk away from conversations that still matter to them. They walk away once they have already found another way through. They had found their way through weeks ago. The withdrawal message had simply been the moment they stopped pretending the council still had a seat at that particular table. "We need to contact Earth immediately," a delegate near the front called out. "Formally request their fleet operate under council authorization." "They have already told us," I said, loudly enough to cut through the noise, "that they are not interested in further dialogue. What makes you think a request for authorization will be treated any differently than the last 3 requests we ignored from them?" Silence, again, though a different kind this time. The kind that comes when a room full of people realize, all at once, that the ground beneath them has shifted and none of the old rules apply anymore. TiesHFY looked at me across the chamber, and in her expression I saw the same conclusion I had already reached hours earlier, sitting alone at my terminal, with Peter's stolen data still glowing on the screen. The council could argue and debate and pass motions and draft formal requests that would take days to translate into all 43 official languages. Or someone could actually go and find out what was happening from the people who already understood it before the council's slowness cost lives that mattering committees would spend months arguing over afterward. "I want to go to Earth," I said, before I had fully decided to say it out loud. Unofficially, outside council channels. I need to understand what they found, and I need to understand it before this chamber decides on a response based on nothing but panic and old transcripts. "The council has not authorized any contact with Earth," TiesHFY said, though there was something in her voice that sounded less like a refusal and more like a formality being observed for the record. "Then don't authorize it," I said. "Let me go as myself, not as a council representative. Just as someone who wants to understand what's actually happening before more people die over a border committee's negligence." She studied me for a long moment, the chamber still churning with noise around us, delegates shouting for votes and motions and formal statements that would accomplish nothing except delay. "If you go," she said quietly, "you go alone, and you go now. Whatever you find, Oren, bring it back to me directly, not to the chamber, not yet. I need to know what we're dealing with before this room decides to do something we cannot undo." I did not sleep again before my transport left the station 3 hours later. I spent that time reviewing every scrap of Peter's data, every transcript from the border committee, every word Warren Locke had told me about the species I was about to travel toward, uninvited, into the middle of whatever it was they had already decided to face without us. I did not know, as my transport cleared the station's outer ring and turned toward the long, dark stretch of space between Council territory and Earth, that I was flying toward the only clear answers I would find in this entire crisis. I only knew that the Council's silence, its slowness, its endless committees, had already cost us weeks we could not get back, and that somewhere ahead of me, humanity had stopped waiting for people like me to catch up, a very long time ago. The journey would take the better part of 2 days, and I spent every hour of it certain of only one thing. Whatever I found on Earth would not be reassurance. It would be a reckoning, and I was flying directly into the middle of it, uninvited and unprepared, because I had finally understood that the alternative, waiting for the Council to act, was no longer a choice I could live with. By the time I landed, the Council chamber I had left behind was already tearing itself apart. I did not witness it directly, but the messages found me anyway, arriving in bursts on my personal channel every few hours as my transport crossed the distance toward Earth. Delegates were accusing each other of concealing the border committee's failures. Someone had leaked the tabled reports to a wider audience, and now half the chamber was demanding an investigation into who had buried them in the first place, while the other half was demanding immediate sanctions against Earth for acting without authorization, as if authorization was something humanity had ever needed from a body that had spent a year and a half ignoring their warnings. Nel Ashra's private messages to me were shorter and more honest than anything said in open session. The Council is arguing about blame while 3 border systems sit exposed, she wrote, during one of the brief windows my transport had signal. Find me something useful, Oren. Blame will still be there when we get back. I read that message twice and understood, more clearly than anything else that had happened so far, exactly how much smaller the Council had become in my mind over the past several days. An institution I had served for over a decade, that I had once believed represented the best cooperative effort of dozens of species, now looked, from this distance, like a room full of people arguing about seating arrangements while the building around them quietly burned. Earth, when my transport finally descended through its atmosphere, looked nothing like the chaos I expected. I do not know precisely what I had pictured, perhaps something closer to the Council chamber, full of raised voices and visible fear. Instead, I found a strange, focused quiet, the kind of quiet that comes not from an absence of activity, but from an excess of purpose. Vehicles moved with clear destinations, people walked with clear intentions, nobody seemed to be arguing about anything at all, and that, more than any fleet deployment or sensor reading, was what finally convinced me that humanity had already moved past the stage of panic the Council was still stuck in. I was met at the landing platform not by Ambassador Daniel Cole, as I had half expected, but by a woman in a military uniform who introduced herself as Admiral Laura Bennett and who looked at me with an expression that held no hostility, but also no particular warmth. "You're the Council speaker who went off channel," she said. It was not quite a question. "I am Vexthal Oren," I said. "I came because I believe the Council failed your people, and I would like to understand exactly how badly, before more mistakes are made." She studied me for a long moment, the way a person studies a tool they are not yet certain how to use. "Ambassador Cole is expecting you," she said finally. "Come with me." We walked together through a facility that hummed with quiet, coordinated activity, past rooms full of analysts studying tactical displays, past technicians running diagnostics on equipment I did not recognize, past a wall of screens showing fleet positions along the border systems I had only ever seen represented as abstract markers on Council maps. Here, they were real ships, crewed by real people, already arranged in patterns that suggested weeks of planning rather than days of reaction. "You've been preparing for this a long time," I said. "Longer than you'd probably believe," Laura Bennett said, without slowing her pace. "We started serious contingency planning about a year ago, right after our second border report got tabled without review. That was when Daniel told me the Council wasn't going to help us in time, whatever happened out there. So we stopped waiting on the Council's timeline and started working on our own. And you never told us that." She glanced at me sideways. "We told you 3 times. You just weren't the ones listening." I had no answer for that, because she was right, and we both knew it. We found Ambassador Daniel Cole in a small briefing room, standing over a table covered in overlapping displays, deep in quiet conversation with 2 of his staff. He looked up when we entered, and for a moment I saw something flicker across his face that I had not expected, not anger, not triumph. Something closer to tired relief, the look of a man who has been carrying an argument alone for a very long time and is not entirely sure he wants to keep carrying it. "Third speaker Oren," he said, "I did not expect the Council to send anyone, especially not off-channel." "The Council did not send me," I said. "I came on my own judgment, because I believe you were right, and I believe the Council owes you an accounting it has not yet given." Something shifted in his expression, small but real. He gestured to a chair across the table, and I sat. "Then let's talk," he said, "since apparently that's still something one of you is willing to do." I spent the next several hours in that room, listening to Daniel Cole and his staff lay out, in careful and unemotional detail, exactly what human censors had found over the past year, and exactly how many times they had tried to bring it to the Council's attention through proper channels. It matched everything I had already learned from Peter's stolen data and the archived transcripts, but hearing it directly from the people who had lived through the frustration of being ignored made it land differently. Not as an abstract failure of bureaucracy, but as a slow, grinding erosion of trust, one dismissed report at a time. "We are not angry that the Council doubted us," Daniel said. At one point, when I asked him directly why they had chosen silence over confrontation. "Doubt is reasonable. We doubted our own censors, at first. We ran the data 3 separate times before we even submitted the first report, because we didn't want to raise an alarm over nothing." "Then what are you angry about?" I asked. "We're not angry," he said, and there was something in the flatness of his voice that convinced me it was true. "We're finished. There's a difference. Anger wants the other person to change. We stopped wanting that a long time ago. We just wanted to be free to act, without waiting for a vote from people who had already shown us they weren't going to take the danger seriously in time to matter." "The Council is in chaos over your withdrawal," I said. "They fear this means the end of any cooperative structure between our peoples." Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "We didn't sever ties to punish the Council," he finally said. "We severed ties because every hour we spent arguing about jurisdiction and authorization was an hour we weren't spending preparing for something we already knew was coming. You cannot run committee meetings and defend a border at the same time, Speaker Oren. Eventually you have to choose one." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the tactical displays shift and update around us, ships moving into new formations along a border that, until very recently, the wider galaxy had not even known was under threat. "What is out there?" I finally asked. "What did your censors actually find?" Daniel exchanged a glance with Laura Bennett, and something passed between them that I could not fully read. "We don't know exactly what it is," he admitted. "We know its patterns. We know it has been testing our borders for months, probing for weaknesses, watching how we respond. We know it does not communicate on any frequency your Council has catalogued, and we know it has not attempted contact of any kind. It simply watches and moves, and occasionally pushes just far enough to see what happens." "That sounds less like an invasion," I said slowly, "and more like a very patient study." "That's exactly what worries us," Laura Bennett said. "An enemy that wants territory, you can predict. An enemy that wants to understand exactly how you'll respond before it commits to anything, that's a very different kind of danger, and it's not one your Council's slow committees are built to handle." "Then help me understand your strategy," I said. "If you cannot predict what it wants, how do you prepare against it?" Laura pulled up a new display, one showing a slow, careful pattern of human ship movements along the border, arranged not in an aggressive formation, but in something closer to a quiet, watchful perimeter. "We stopped trying to predict its intentions months ago," she said. "Instead, we focused on making sure it could not learn anything more from watching us. We changed our sensor patterns. We varied our response times. We made ourselves harder to read, because the one thing we could control was how much information we handed over, simply by reacting the way it expected us to." "That is a very patient strategy," I said. "It is the only strategy that made sense," Daniel said from across the table. "You cannot outthink an unknown variable, Speaker Oren. You can only make yourself a harder variable to solve. That takes discipline, and it takes time, and it takes not spending that time arguing with a committee about who has jurisdiction to authorize the next censor sweep." I sat with that for a long moment, watching the display shift and reconfigure itself with quiet, careful precision, a strategy built not out of aggression, but out of exhausted patience, with an institution that had never given humanity the room to prepare any other way. I left that briefing room hours later with more understanding than I had arrived with, and a growing, uncomfortable certainty that the Council's failure was not simply a matter of bureaucratic negligence. It was a fundamental mismatch between the pace of the threat and the pace of the institution meant to respond to it. Humanity had recognized that mismatch months ago and had quietly built a solution around it, without waiting for the rest of us to agree that a solution was necessary. I sent a brief, careful message back to Nell Ashra that night, summarizing what I had learned without revealing details I suspected Daniel Cole would not want spread through the wider chamber just yet. Her reply came faster than I expected. "Bring back everything you can," she wrote, "and Oren, be honest with me. Is there still a place for the council in whatever comes next, or have we already made ourselves irrelevant to it?" I did not answer that question that night, because I did not yet know the honest answer. But I suspected, lying awake in a guest quarters on a planet that had spent the last year quietly preparing for a war the rest of the galaxy did not know was coming, that the answer would depend entirely on what the council chose to do in the days immediately ahead, and whether, for once, it could move fast enough to matter. The next morning, I was told that Daniel Cole wanted to see me again, alone this time, before I returned to the station. I did not know it yet, but that conversation would be the one that finally made everything clear, not just about why humanity had left the table, but about what they intended to do now that they had. He was waiting for me on an open balcony overlooking the facility, a cup of something warm in his hands, watching the early morning light spread across a landing field full of quietly moving aircraft. He did not turn when I approached, and for a moment we simply stood there together, in a silence that felt very different from the silence that had started all of this. "You've been walking through my people's work for a full day now," he finally said. "What do you think of what you've found?" "I think," I said carefully, "that I understand why you stopped talking to us. I am less certain I understand what happens next." He nodded slowly, still watching the field. "Ask me your questions, Speaker Oren. I suspect you have more than a few." I had spent the entire night composing them, and still, standing there, I found only one seemed to matter enough to ask first. "Do you intend to fight this alone? Whatever is out there, past the border, without the council, without any of us?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, turning his cup slowly in his hands. "We intend to face it," he said. "Whether the council joins us or not is not really our decision to make. It's yours. All we decided was that we were no longer willing to let your decision determine our timeline. That sounds like a very careful distinction. It is a very important one," he said, finally turning to look at me. "We did not leave the table because we stopped caring what happens to the rest of you. We left because staying at that table, waiting for consensus that never came, was going to get people killed. Ours, and possibly yours as well, eventually, once whatever is out there decides it has learned enough about us to move further. The Council fears this means humanity considers itself separate from the rest of us now," I said, "independent, beyond obligation." Daniel gave a short, humorless laugh. "The Council fears the wrong thing then. We are not trying to be separate from anyone. We are trying to survive something the Council refused to look directly at for a year and a half, and we have run out of patience for waiting on permission to do that. Then what do you want from us, if not authorization, if not partnership through the old channels?" He considered the question for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost some of its careful diplomatic edge and become something closer to simply tired and honest. "I want the Council to stop being an obstacle," he said. "That's all. I don't need your permission to defend a border my people have been quietly holding for months already. What I need is for your committees to stop treating real threats like scheduling inconveniences, so that the next time somebody brings you a warning, you actually look at it before it's too late to matter." I thought of Warren Locke's cluttered little room, of the transcripts I had read late into the night, of a report submitted and tabled and quietly closed after 14 months of silence. "We failed you," I said. "Not once. 3 times." "You did," Daniel agreed, without any satisfaction in saying it. "We didn't leave because we were angry about that failure, Speaker Oren. We left because we finally understood that waiting for you to stop failing us was a luxury we no longer had time for." I stood with him in that quiet morning light for a while longer, neither of us speaking, until he finally set his cup down on the railing and turned to face me fully. "We didn't leave the table," he said, and something in the way he said it told me this was the exact sentence he had been waiting to give someone from the council, the sentence he had likely composed long before I ever arrived. "We just stopped waiting for you to sit down." I carried those words with me for the entire journey back to Council Station, turning them over again and again, trying to find some version of them that made the council look less foolish, and failing every time. By the time my transport docked, word had already spread that I had traveled to Earth without authorization, and I was summoned before the full council chamber almost immediately, still travel-worn, still carrying the weight of everything I had seen and heard on a planet that had quietly prepared for war while the rest of us argued about procedure. The chamber was fuller than I had ever seen it, every species represented, every delegate aware that whatever I said in the next few minutes would shape how the council responded to a crisis that was no longer abstract or distant. TiesHFY stood at the center podium and gestured for me to take the floor, and for the first time in my career as third speaker, I felt no hesitation at all about what I intended to say. "You have all heard, by now, that humanity has severed diplomatic ties," I began. "Many of you have spent the last several days debating what this means, whether it is an insult, whether it requires sanctions, whether it signals some larger betrayal of our shared institutions. I have just returned from Earth, and I can tell you, plainly, that you have been debating the wrong question entirely." A murmur moved through the chamber, but I did not let it slow me. "Humanity did not leave this table in anger," I continued. "They left because this council, this body, ignored 3 separate warnings over the past year and a half, warnings about a real and patient threat gathering along our shared border, warnings that were tabled, delayed, and quietly closed by a committee more concerned with procedure than with survival. Humanity did not abandon cooperation. This council abandoned its responsibility to listen, and humanity finally stopped waiting for us to remember what that responsibility meant." 4. The chamber was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that comes when a room full of people are forced to hear something they already suspected but had hoped to avoid confirming. "They have spent the last year quietly preparing to face this threat without us," I said. "Their fleets are already positioned. Their sensors have already mapped patterns none of our own committees bothered to investigate. They are not asking for our permission to defend that border, because they have already learned, through repeated and painful experience, that our permission arrives too slowly to matter." "What do they want from us, then?" TiesHFY asked, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber. "They want us to stop being an obstacle," I said. "They are not asking us to fight this for them. They are asking us to stop wasting the time that fighting it will require. If this council wishes to remain relevant to what comes next, it will need to move faster than it has ever moved before, and it will need to start taking human warnings seriously the moment they arrive, not 18 months after they have stopped mattering." I paused, letting the weight of that settle across the chamber, and then delivered the part of my report I knew would be hardest for many of them to hear. "Humanity is not gone," I said. "They have not abandoned us, and they have not declared war on this council, whatever some of you have feared these past several days. But they are done asking permission to protect what the rest of us were too slow to defend. Whatever threat is gathering past our border, it has been watching all of us for months, learning our patterns, testing our responses, and the only reason we are not already facing it unprepared is that one species among us refused to wait for the rest of us to catch up." The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking, 43 species absorbing a truth that none of them, myself included, had wanted to hear stated so plainly. TiesHFY was the first to speak, her voice quiet but carrying clearly through the stillness. "Then I propose," she said, "that this council's first act, its very first, be an honest accounting of every warning we have dismissed over the past 2 years, human or otherwise, and a commitment to review any future warning within days, not months, not because Earth demands it of us, but because we have finally been shown, at great cost to our own credibility, exactly what happens when we fail to listen. The vote that followed was not unanimous, because nothing in the council chamber ever was, but it passed by a wide enough margin that even the delegates who had spent the previous days demanding sanctions against Earth found themselves quietly withdrawing those proposals rather than defend them in the shadow of what I had just described. I do not know, even now, exactly what waits for us in the dark systems past the perimeter, or how long humanity's patient preparation will hold against whatever has been watching us all from beyond our border. I know only that the threat has not disappeared simply because the Council has finally agreed to take it seriously, and that the days ahead will demand more honesty and more speed from this institution than it has managed in generations. What I carry with me now, more than any fear of what comes next, is the memory of standing on that quiet balcony with Daniel Cole, watching the early light spread across a field of aircraft prepared for a war the rest of the galaxy had only just begun to acknowledge. "We didn't leave the table," he told me. "We just stopped waiting for you to sit down." I think of those words often now, in the sessions that have followed, in the long nights spent reviewing every warning this council has ever dismissed, searching for others we may have missed. I think of them because they were not spoken in anger, and they were not spoken as a threat. They were spoken as a simple, quiet fact, the kind of fact that only becomes visible once you have already been too slow to act on it. Humanity is still out there, holding a border the rest of us barely understood was under threat, still preparing, still watching, still moving forward without waiting for our approval. Whether the Council has truly learned anything from what nearly cost us everything, I cannot yet say. I only know that the silence, which once frightened me so deeply in that darkened embassy, has become something else entirely. It has become a warning we can no longer afford to ignore, and a reminder that the next time someone tries to tell us something important, we had better be ready to listen the first time, because we may not get a fourth chance to hear it again before it is too late for any of us. A few days after my report to the chamber, I received a short message from Peter Lang, who had been quietly reinstated to full embassy duty once the human staff resumed limited contact with select council representatives, myself included. It contained only a handful of lines, but I have kept it since, alongside the transcripts and reports that started this entire search. Daniel says thank you for coming to Earth instead of waiting for permission to understand us. He says that is the first thing the Council has done in 2 years that actually mattered on time. I read it standing at the same observation deck where I had once sat alone in the dark, watching a dead embassy across an empty plaza, wondering why a species that argued so passionately had suddenly gone quiet. The embassy lights were on again now, not because the old arrangement had been fully restored, but because a narrower, more careful channel of cooperation had begun to take shape between our peoples, one built less on formal treaties and more on something harder won, and I suspected, considerably more durable. Trust, rebuilt slowly, one honest conversation at a time. I do not know what the coming months will bring, along that quiet, watchful border where humanity has spent a year preparing for a threat the rest of us only just learned to take seriously. I know only that I intend to keep listening, more carefully than I ever have before, because I have finally understood what it cost us the first time we did not. Somewhere out past the perimeter, something patient is still watching, still learning, still waiting for the moment our attention slips again. And for the first time since this crisis began, I find myself certain of one thing above all else. Whatever comes next, we will not be facing it in silence, and we will not be facing it too late.